Welcome to the Church and Culture Podcast, a weekly discussion with Dr. James Emery White on the latest trends happening in culture and where and how the church should respond. Jim is the founding and senior pastor of Mecklenburg Community Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, president of Serious Times, a ministry devoted to exploring the intersection of faith and culture, former professor of theology and culture at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where he also served as their fourth president, and the author of more than 20 books. I am your host, Alexis Drye, and I can't wait to dive into this week's conversation. Awesome. Well, welcome back. Whenever I want to get to know someone, I tend to ask them one of three things. I usually say, what do you do for work and play? Or what books are you reading? Or what shows are you watching? Well, when it comes to that last question, there has been one show that just keeps coming up over and over again in conversation, and it's the Apple TV series Severance. Now, Severance has become something of a modern cultural phenomenon, and it's Apple TV's most watched series in its history, recently surpassing the former leader, which was Ted Lasso. And it only just concluded its second season last week. So, Jim,
after a 3-year delay.
Oh, really? I did not know that. Okay. Well, for any
both.
of our viewers who have not seen Severance, can you give a brief synopsis? But of course, no spoilers.
Yeah, well, as a diehard Severance fan, I really am. I wouldn't dream of spoiling it for anyone who hasn't watched it yet or particularly hasn't finished the second season. Severance debuted 3 years ago, as you mentioned, on Apple. The idea behind Severance is really intriguing, and it's multi-layered. It's the basic premise is that you can undergo this procedure that involves planting a microchip in the back of your head that then separates your work self from the rest of your identity. It's triggered so that as you enter into the building where you work, Lumen Industries in this case, that pioneered the technology, the minute the elevator opens and you enter in, it kicks in and you have no memory of your outside life. The appeal is more than simply gaining a work-life balance, though. It's really about escaping difficult feelings or experiences, or at least that part of your life. The characters literally live two different lives, because when they exit the work, same thing happens. They get in the elevator, they forget that whole life. And so their innies, as they're referred to, no relation to belly buttons, are their work selves. Their outies exist everywhere, anywhere outside of work. So there's an innie self and an outie self. As part of the severance, they've chosen to work, because the people that pioneer this technology, as I mentioned, are Lumen Industries, and they've chosen to work at Lumen as a severed person. And that's a shadowy biotech company with cultish overtones where they are severed from their personal lives, meaning their consciousness is split into these two parts. And their innies and their outies have no idea what's going on in each other's world. So one's body, one's soul, if you will, is the same, but their memory is suppressed when they go to work, and then when they leave in such a way that they have no memory of what happens at work. And when at work, they have no memory of what happened or happens when not at work. And I mean no memory at all, no relationship. If they're married, they don't know they're married. If they have children, they don't know they have children, all of that. What they're not told is that their severed personalities, their innies, really become a separate person with a separate life. They form different and unique personal relationships. Their personalities and even their characters, even their ability to succeed or fail, differentiate. This is really important, they aren't free. They're like slaves, second-class humans, and their outies treat them that way, and Lumen treats them that way and sees them that way, unbeknownst to their outies. So instead of an escape, they have been sentenced to this mind-numbing hell. So that's the central premise. But from that, it gets fun, as if that's not already enough to explore. But the series is so much more. It really, first, for example, it really world builds. Think of the old show Lost. Only this time the writers seem to know where they're going. By world building, I mean they really are creating a world, a reality that's unique unto itself, and it is mind-blowing, mind-expanding. You really do end every episode wanting to just talk about what you just saw and what it all means. And second, there's a mystery going on about what Lumen Industries is really trying to do. What the people who work there are really about, why the practice of severance was introduced in the first place. Like what's really behind that? Third, and I'm sure we'll get into this, there are huge questions related to the big issues of existence. What does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to have worth? What does it mean to be a person? What does it mean to be a human? What does it mean to have a soul or consciousness? What does it mean to be a unified human being? And on it goes. I mean, it's rare that a show raises so many metaphysical and spiritual questions. Fourth, the premise lets the show explore all kinds of deep questions about morality and ethics. And then finally, though, there's a lot more that the show does. There's a sense of the sitcom The Office about it, which was another one of my favorite series. I mean, it can be funny, just laugh out loud funny, and really lampoons office life. Particularly the first season does this and really digs into cubicle culture. It can be, just funny and weird at the same time, drawing you down a rabbit hole of what it all means. And it all works. It just works through great writing and great acting and a storyline that's been thought through that keeps you engaged and really draws you in deeper and deeper, making you not only want to find out what the heck is really going on, but you also really begin to care deeply about the characters.
I feel like several of our listeners have just Googled how to access this show on Apple TV so they can watch it. I want to tease out in today's conversation a few of those elements and that you just mentioned that seem to be making, or I guess behind the reason why it's making such huge waves in culture. Beginning with this work life and home life separation and the psychological ramifications of that. Why is that aspect of the show really resonating with people?
Well, on one level, isn't that just the way it is? I mean, isn't that there's just a real identification with all things work. I mentioned it has some resonance with the sitcom The Office. People identified with The Office because it was like their office, okay, maybe extreme and lampooned and parodied, but there was an identity. You could say, yeah, that's kind of the way it is. I've got someone like that at my office, or we did something stupid like that, or that happened, whatever. Severance captures a lot of the same dynamic, both in terms of the set, the hallways, the cubicles, the breaks, the infantile parties, the reward systems. I mean, things that you roll your eyes out, but you also say, they did something like that at where I worked, Even the job itself, called microdata refinement, their department is called microdata refinement, is boring, it's repetitive, it's staring at a screen at numbers without any sense of why or what it's all for. But there's something much deeper than that, I think, at play. Let's go back to the premise of the show, because it's not just a premise, it's a promise. Namely, that you can separate your work self from the rest of yourself or the rest of your identity. In other words, the ultimate work-life balance. And that's intriguing to people on at least a couple of levels, I think. The first level is that many of us already feel like we live in two worlds. I think the average person does. That there's our work world and there's our home world. There's our work with its demands and its realities and its people and its relationships and its highs and its lows and its physical surroundings. And then when we clock out, we drive off. And then there's the world of our home and our family and our spouse and our children and our friends and our neighbors and our cookouts and our soccer games. A show that makes these two worlds has a lot to play with. That hits people on multiple levels of interest and engagement, identification. It's even put the words innie and outie into our cultural lexicon. I mean, you're seeing this all over the place. We really do have our work selves, our outie selves, and we have our outside of work selves, and our outies and our work selves, our innies. And it's interesting, when you're at home, you dress differently than you do at work. You dress differently. You might eat differently. Your outie may party late at night while the innie has to deal with the hangover. And so we almost live and act and breathe and think this way. So we want to separate work from home. And we often do it by compartmentalizing them. Severance just takes that to an extreme, makes it official through a microchip. But then there is the promise of the premise, which is the escape from work. And the escape from the work world and the work life and the work person. That's just one of the big ideas that the show pursues throughout. Namely, can you ever escape who you are? Even through a type of severance? Is that possible? Is that even best? Even though they have, and when it's interesting because even though they have relationships as outies, they still crave relationships as innies. They have the same basic wants. They have the same basic needs. They have the same fears. They face the same consequences. They escape their outie world only to create another one as an innie. In other words, there is no real escape. At least that's the opening idea as the show begins.
Well, even within the show, there's some moral tension between characters regarding the reasons why people would choose that route of severance. And offline, before the podcast, I had sent you an article that I really appreciated from Christianity Today that explored, in relation to severance, the limitations of escapism, as you just brought up. Do you mind talking about that in a little bit more in relation to severance?
I just mentioned how the promise of severance, a real work-life balance, may be unreachable. And that really is one of the ideas that the show pursues, that it is unreachable. But there's more. So many of the people who agree to be severed aren't really after a work-home balance. It's not what they're after. They're wanting an escape from grief, an escape from pain, an escape from depression, an escape from failure, disillusionment, disappointment. This isn't giving anything away as it's explored immediately in the very first episode. But the main character, Mark Scout, that's his name on the outside, and his innie is just Mark S. Everybody just goes by the initial of their last name, but Mark S. But Mark Scout pursued the severance program because he was grieving the death of his wife, Gemma. He wanted to compartmentalize his grief. He wants to escape the pain of her death. At least for as much of his life as he can. And in this case, while he's at work. So this basically gave him a chance to, for 8+ hours a day, in his mind, forget, live a life that's free of that grief. But the show raises a very deep and important question. If you could separate yourself from your pain, would it help? Would it make you a happier person? Would it solve anything? Would it get you past it? Or would it always remain? Or would your innie just develop their own traumas? Their own new set of disappointments that would have to be lived with on the inside. Or as one person who asks Mark during the first season, and I'll have to watch how I say this, but they said, do you ever think that maybe the best way to deal with an effed up situation in your life isn't to just shut your brain off half the time? But the show goes further. And again, I don't think I'm revealing too much here, but you even find more reasons for people getting severed, such as pursuing temporary severance to avoid pain, such as with childbirth, or going to the dentist, or even writing thank you notes. Anything you don't want to do, anything you want to avoid, you can just be severed, have your innie do that, and you come out of it and you never even know that you did it. So the idea of a distress-free world, a world free of suffering, is also at hand. That's kind of what's being tantalizingly put in front of people, not just a work-life balance, but a life free of what you don't want to do. But the article you mentioned, and many articles, have just raised really deep, profound things and about this. It's just one of those kind of series that generates it. We've got a whole bunch of links in the show notes that you'll want to take advantage of. But as the article you particularly mentioned raised, and they're not alone, is would that really be best? Would that really be best? The Christian life is not about a pain-free life. You're just not going to find that in Scripture. It's not about a storm-free life. It's about a God who will see us through the pain, a God who will see us through the storm. I believe it was Henri Nouwen who wrote about how that asking what has wounded us is like asking who has made us, or what has made us. And the book of James talks about this extensively. I just sometimes, when I was reading this, I couldn't help but think about James and about how your faith is tested, and when your faith is tested, it creates endurance, or it provides the opportunity for endurance to grow and to take root in your life. Because when your endurance is developed, then your faith is on the way to being perfected. For faith to produce itself in life, it just needs challenges. Times and situations where faith is needed. I mean, how do you build faith? Find yourself in situations where faith is needed, and then you choose faith. It's like a muscle. It needs to be exercised. And if you don't put it into situations where it's going to be exercised, it just won't develop. And very few people look for faith-needed situations because they're uncomfortable. There's a helplessness there. You're choosing something out of your power where you have to have faith. And so it's kind of ironic. We all want faith. We all say our faith matters, but none of us want faith-building situations or experiences in our life. But here's how faith is exercised, that muscle. So when you face a challenge, when you face a trial, when you face a difficulty, you have a choice. You can endure or quit. And endurance is based on your reliance and trust in God. If you endure, then you grow. You mature. You become something bigger, better, deeper, brighter, stronger than you were. You don't break. You break out, if you will. James says you become perfect. He doesn't mean that in the literal sense, but not in the sense of sinless perfection, but in the sense of being who you were made to be in Christ and increasingly becoming who you were made to be in Christ. But it only comes with a trial. It's like the way steel is forged. It's through the fire. It's the heat that makes it strong. So the joy comes from what God can accomplish in your life through your trial. So does the strength. I think we actually talked about this recently on a podcast. I can't remember, but in biology, it's called the adversity principle. They've discovered that habitual, ongoing well-being is not good for a species, that any existence without challenge is actually not healthy. For example, you see it in the flabby animals in a zoo that have their food delivered to them every day. You see it in rainforest trees because water is everywhere. They don't have to extend their root system down particularly deep, just a few feet below the surface, which is why the slightest windstorm can knock a massive tree over in that particular environment. But a tree planted in dry land that survives had to send its roots down 30 feet or more in search of water, and not even a gale force wind can knock those trees down. It's no different with our life. Our pain is often what, as I said, developed us, it's strengthened us, it's allowed us our ability to grow if we let it. If we let it forge an enduring spirit, as opposed to crippling us and breaking us because we didn't respond. So trials create that moment. A life in Christ that means something, that is real and isn't just spiritual lip service, is one that is chosen. And I do believe in that chosenness. James talks about it as a choice. The Bible talks about it as a choice. The choice to persevere, the choice to have faith, the choice to trust, the choice to hope. I mean, throughout scriptures, it's a choice. It's a choice. It's a choice. And as C.S. Lewis says, those choices make us, develop us, turning us toward a hellish creature or a heavenly creature. It shapes your entire life. Yeah, and I'll never forget something that I caught many years ago on TV one summer during it was a 1 hour program on the Hawaiian Open Ironman triathlon. And if you're not familiar with that event, it is the premier triathlon competition in the world. And it deserves its name. If you know anything about it, it involves a swim in the open ocean of over 2 miles, followed by over 100 miles of biking, ending with a full marathon run, which is just over 26 miles, back to back to back. But what grabbed me was not the competition itself, but the stories it was telling of the people involved, their strength of will, their fight to the finish. And one of the individuals profiled was a woman named Lynn Brooks, who was competing at the time of this program in her 19th Ironman. That takes enormous commitment and obvious devotion. She talked about how one year, like I think the reporter asked her something like 19. How do you pull off 19? And she talked about something that if my memory serves, happened during her very first Ironman. During the marathon leg of the competition, she left the race, exhausted, and entered into one of the aid tents that had been set up periodically by the side of the road. And her body was aching and her emotions were drained, and the desire to stop, to just end it all there, was just overpowering. And when she entered the tent, there was one other person there as well. And she looked over, and sitting on that bench, there was a man who had also been competing, but he had really made his decision. His shoes were off, his socks were off, he was resting, he was relaxing, and he had popped open and was drinking an ice cold beer. And as if he was reading her thoughts, he looked over at her, kind of lifted up his drink, took a swig, and said, "All you have to do is drop out of the race like me." And suddenly, she said, she realized who he was. She said he was the devil. And she immediately left the tent and re-entered the race. Reflecting on that moment, just filled her eyes with tears. And she said, that was the hardest and most glorious day of my life. I'll never forget that. Hardest and most glorious. And I think that's what the scriptures are talking about. And I mentioned James, about trials bring your faith to the surface for testing and development in a way nothing else can. Because in a trial, you either turn to God or you'll turn away from God. And if you turn to him, your faith goes higher up and deeper in. And it will be the hardest but most glorious day of your life. All to say, the solution of severance, at least when applied to pain and suffering, is no solution at all. It's really no escape at all. It cheapens our life and what God may be wanting to do in and through our pain and our suffering. That article you mentioned, I thought one of the best lines from it, and I wrote this down, just brought it with me because I didn't want to forget it. One of the best lines was when she writes, if philosophers and theologians posit that the human experience demands suffering, severance both underscores and inverts this truth. Suffering demands a human experience. At Lumen, every attempt to rid one's life of pain merely begets another human whose existence will be defined by that pain.
That's insightful. Oh, gosh. Well, another underlying theme of the show that you mentioned already is just the basic human need for connection. That's obviously hardly news that humans need to connect with other humans, but what is it about this show in particular that's bringing that need to the surface and in maybe more impactful or innovative ways?
I think it's the way that the innies, who had been severed from their outie selves, continue to need exactly what their outies needed. And sought after exactly what their outies were trying to gain, maybe through the severance. In other words, the desires didn't change, and particularly relational desires, which is what so much of the series explores. And many articles have explored this. Particularly, there's one I remember reading in the Atlantic, and we'll put, again, that and many others in the show notes. And I think I can talk about this without giving away too much in terms of spoilers, because I've been trying to be very careful about that, because the surprises are just so much fun in this series. But I can say this without giving something away. Mark, who chooses to be severed in order to compartmentalize his grief over his wife's death, eventually falls for another innie. His colleague Irving, overwhelmed by his loneliness when outside of Lumen's confines, also develops feelings for someone. Dylan, who's hilarious, by the way, whose outie is disillusioned by his suburban doldrums, finds a fanatical sort of motivation within the mysterious computer assignment his team is required to compete. But then later, despite the confidence his work has given him, he finds himself obsessively coveting his outie's family and his outie's home life. The point is that innies and outies share elements of their foundational selves. They have the same wants, they have the same needs, and particularly relational needs. And this is just laid bare. And it just shows that the one thing we cannot escape is our need for community, our need for intimacy, and our need for love.
Well, less talked about than the innies and outies, but perhaps to your point at the top of the episode, is the more central idea that this question or the series asks in relation to human identity. How does it do that, and what should it prompt us to consider about our own lives?
This was huge for me as I began watching it. I was just like so hoping they would go there. I kept thinking, and I think they have started to more and more, particularly in season 2, but I kept thinking that they were missing one of the key issues, or at least weren't getting around to it, which is that in all this talk of innies and outies and separate lives and separate relationships, you're really almost made to feel that these really are two separate people. But they're not. The outies, are feeling like their innies weren't real people to be valued or concerned about unless it affected them as outies. In other words, if they harmed themselves as innies, cut off their finger or something, well, then obviously when the next day the outie woke up, he wouldn't have a finger, but it's like they were all missing the point. This really is the same person. This is the same person. One had suppressed memories. That was it. Just suppressed memories. Same body, same consciousness, same soul, same personality, same everything. Yes, it raises how nature versus nurture shapes us, because the innies were free of the nurture of the memories. So they were operating free of those memories, theoretically free of all the learnings and the gatherings that they had made. And so when they're severed from your memory, it kind of does explore how maybe you become a different person, a better person or a worse person as an innie. But they were just microchips severed. They weren't metaphysically or physically severed. Now, how the show obscures whether innies and outies should be considered parts of a single being, making it difficult for viewers to kind of know how to judge their behavior as an outie or judge their behavior as an innie, is one of the kind of conceits of the show. But we know how the outies feel, and it's rather horrific. One of the dynamics of agreeing to be severed is that you can resign from your innie self or your severed job, but your outie has to agree. Has to. So when Helly R, one of the characters, tried to resign, her outie refused her. So Helly retaliates by attempting to hurt herself physically. And since they share a body, she hopes it will get her outie's attention. I mentioned cutting her finger. That's what she was going to do. And then she receives a video message from her outie, who views Helly as subhuman. And this is what she says. I jotted just down. I think this is close to word for word, but maybe close to a paraphrase. But she says, I understand that you're unhappy with the life that you've been given. But you know what? Eventually, we all have to accept reality. So here it is. I am a person. You are not. I make the decisions. You do not. And if you ever do anything to my fingers, know that I will keep you alive long enough to have you horribly regret that. I wish I could get more into the character, by the way, of Helly R without giving away spoilers that are way too much fun to come your way while you're watching, particularly in season 2. But it begins to delve into how the outies view their innies, how they treat their innies, how they interact with their innies, even betray their innies, and how the innies turn around and view their outies and treat their outies and interact with their outies and even try and hurt their outies. It's fascinating. It really is fascinating. But at the end of the season, of season 2, in its finale, Helly R gives her own verdict in relation to the question. And I thought it was really quite powerful. And it'll be interesting to see where the show goes with that. But she gives her own verdict in relation to herself. And again, I can share this without giving away her story or the twists that might be involved in what led her to say this. But when her innie is asked by another innie about her outie, she comes to a conclusion. I am her. Don't forget, that is who I am. We're one thing. We're one person. And that's true. And I think that the series is going to be exploring that more while they also explore how they're different. It's a fascinating interplay. But that also adds to the complexity of the show's promise and how much it still has to explore in terms of what that means for everyone involved, along with how much the separated cells become independent of each other. I'll just say, I don't want to give any more away, but I can't wait for season 3, which I'm glad to say has been made official. And
it won't be another 5 years from now.
And we will not wait years for it. They have promised. So they're on it. And so yeah.
Awesome. Well, this has been fun. It's always so fun to be able to talk about things that people are already talking about all around us and just maybe give a little bit different of a perspective, a more thoughtful take on something that we consume on a regular basis.
For people who have watched it, there's more to it than goats. We'll leave it at that.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jim. And thank you guys for giving us your ear this week. And we hope you'll join us again next time.